in this podcast, we will actually cover actual lore this time. We did promise that today's subject is going to be quite large. It's
very
quite big. It's going to cast a big shadow on everything, and the topic is, fortresses and strongholds.
We give out a definition, like it could be different from you and me, what a fortress is, so that we have a better understanding. Right? So you first.
So in 40k, we do like to meme about the whole fortification. I'm fortifying this comment section meme and Dorn PDS memes where he just goes around fortifying things. And there is a reason for that. And that is because forts are actually very important. Surprise, surprise. And depending on the society, they are symbols of power. And keeping them or dismantling them is very important. It's very critical to the faction's prestige on a more strategic layer. It is something that secures an important objective or an important terrain. It is there to buy time during a battle. Obviously, you have the terrain, and the people inside could be important as well, whether they're governors or bureaucrats or the king or just the population itself. And the taking of a fortress involves a huge amount of investment, and that's why when sieges are conducted, they're usually called, and besides a siege, and I guess it's called an investment actually, and that investment usually breaks or makes a campaign. Sieges are where decisive battles take place in a campaign, and if you do it badly or if you do it well, that's your entire campaign done and gone.
Yeah, because time and resources are not infinite, and once you use them all, then that's it.
Once you used up your campaign supplies, it's gone. You cannot proceed with the war any longer. You cannot go any further, so the only way to go is to go back. You can raid and maraud forever, but for a campaign to be ultimately successful, for you to hold land, you will have to take the fortress. Otherwise, you risk getting your supplies cut off. And in general, it just looks bad. It just looks like you have no power. The status symbol is still there. So that is why in history, the best generals and even the best architects are the masters of siege. And I'm looking at Rogal, Dorn, and Perturabo here. Yep. And
sorry, go on.
Oh, no. And that's why these are usually the objectives of entire campaigns. The entire campaign is built around taking a certain fortress because they are very important historically as well as in 40k.
For me, a definition of fortress, I will just basically solely based on functionality. Okay, a fortress' main goal is to protect something, for one. So it's going to have some very good defense mechanism, either precision-wise, or that they have, armor or whatever means that they can protect themselves from attacks. And second of all is that they can fight back. They're not just going to sit there and take the hit. They will, chip you down, even if you don't go head-to-head. And third most important is that they can actually house a army or a sizable force inside, in case that you do need to counterattack or basically harass people's supply lines. Now, when it comes to fortresses, it doesn't really have to be fixated on what the format is. For example, it doesn't have to be land-based, sea-based, air-based, or space-based. It could be all of them, or any one of them could be a fortress, as long as it fulfills those points that I just made. And one thing that I do want to bring up is that fortresses, while they're good, it's useless if you're placing them in places that they don't really matter. So I think you brought up a very good point, is if you put them in really strategic positions, either that they're on a major supply route or a place where there's simply no other way around it, then that's where they really truly shine. If you just have a really strong fortress out of the middle of fuck all, it doesn't matter. People just have to go around it, right? And as long as they keep the distance and you can't really hit them that hard, it can be avoidable. So I think the placement of the fortress is more important than the actual fortress. So that's my definition of a fortress.
Yes. It's usually a piece of ground that is defensible. And not only that, it's usually a staging point for offenses as well. It's based on very strategic ground that an opponent cannot afford to ignore. Yeah, so let's start. And I think everyone knows about the Iron Cage. Do you know about the Iron Cage?
No, please tell me.
Okay. So the name of the fortress was not actually the Iron Cage, and the fortress was actually called the Eternal Fortress. The name is kind of cheesy, but I think it plays into like baiting Dorn into the entire fiasco. Now, the lore surrounding all of this, once again, is like the Blackstone Fortress. It came from like the first and second Index Astartes, and I think the most recent in-depth explanation of what happened came from like the 6th edition Codex. You know, as the Horus Heresy finished and this happened during the Scouring, there might be updates to this whole event, but I'm just going to cover it as things are right now, as things we know. Yep. So as I mentioned before, this is a whole fiasco between Iron Warriors and Imperial Fists Legions, and if people don't know, these two legions are bitter rivals. The Imperial Fists are the loyalists, and they are the masters of the siege and the fortifications, and so are the Iron Warriors. And the Primarch's personalities are basically opposed to each other. And you know what people say where, you know, people hate... what's that saying called? Where if you resemble someone too much, you kind of hate them. So he's...
Hate is only a single line.
I won't say he loved them, but he wants to destroy them because he wants to prove that he's better, basically. And in this case, the whole idea of the fortress fits into many of the categories where it is a symbol of power to dismantle the entire thing, which is to bait Dorn in. It's an entire blemish during his darkest hours. And it sits on an important objective, only because the planet was important, but because basically the entire Iron Warrior Legion was sitting on top of the planet. And ignoring it would have been too big of a risk. It would have been a staging post for further offensives, even though the heresy is over. The amount of space it commands as a staging post for offensives is just too great to ignore. And so this is a good example of a fortress. Not only was it used as a defensive structure, it was used in a very offensive way as well. And I am saying that in reference to, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the game Shogun 2. Shogun 2 Total War. Yep. Where in that game, they basically placed the Eastern philosophy of the fortress itself becoming a killing ground, other than a purely defensive fortress. So it would slowly attrit the attackers as they come into the fortress, and then they would find themselves into wide open courtyards with more walls in front of them, and there will be basically false areas of weaknesses where it would kind of invite the attackers in, and then when they go through this avenue of attack, they would be immediately set on upon because they would just come across a kill ground, basically. And yeah, so if you haven't played that game, that's what that whole philosophy is. And it's actually very interesting because in a lot of the fortresses in the Horus Heresy and what was mentioned before, they were quite large. They were system-sized fortresses. They were, you know, near planetary-sized fortresses. But if you actually read into this, the whole Iron Cage, the Eternal Fortress, is actually quite small. From what I could gather, it's only 32 square kilometers, and for the American out there, it's 20 square miles of land. So that basically comes down to less than 6 times 6 kilometers for 2 legions to fight over.
When you talk about legion, you mean the actual full legion?
Yep, the full legion of the Iron Warriors versus what remained of the Imperial Fists after the Siege of Terra.
It's kind of small space compared to that.
It could be GW not understanding what scale is. I assume that maybe there's more shit going on underground. It could go underground because it did mention tunnels. But overall, that is a tiny amount of space to do any kind of sieging. Yeah, and when they say that this was an entire bloodbath, they weren't kidding, because that is a lot of Space Marine casualties to be taken in such a small amount of space. So
kind of like Iwo Jima.
Iwo Jima? Yeah, that's a good comparison actually. Yeah. Because
space.
They were basically invited in, and then the door just shut behind them, and then all they could do is just basically keep fighting forward. They know it's going to keep getting worse, but that's all they could do. So the entire event that transpired was that Perdurabo basically put up a neon sign telling Dorn to come attack. And then at this time, Dorn was not a happy fellow. He was very, very pissed off because the Emperor's on the Golden Throne. He's been mortally wounded. Dorn...
I think he's also quite depressed, I think.
Yeah, he was very depressed. He wasn't thinking right. He was very angry. He's probably dealing with a lot of emotions that he normally wouldn't even pay attention to. And
he didn't even know he had.
He didn't even know he had. So he just basically went straight in, and it was specifically said that Dorn went about this the worst way possible, because instead of doing the meticulous planning that the Imperial Fists were known for, Dorn just basically went straight in. He basically was doing his inner Black Templar. He just went straight in without any planning whatsoever. And Dorn did say that he was going to bring back Perdurabo and an Iron Cage. So I guess that's where the whole name came from. And
is there a description of this actual fortress, the small one that you...
Well, there kind of was. There was a description of the size, which was about 32 square kilometers, and it was in the shape of a Chaos Star. So I'm not sure if...
It's hilarious.
Yeah, and this is quite strange because Perdurabo doesn't really believe in the Chaos Gods, according to the Horus Heresy books. So I'm not sure if it's intentional, if he was trying to make a ritual, but I think he was doing that on purpose just to piss off Dorn.
Fair enough.
You can kind of see, like, with the whole, symbol of power kind of thing, like it's like fortresses are kind of like a, in real life, they would put a lot of decorations up. It's basically the seat of power and all that. It's for people to know what's up and who's in control. It's display of power. It's a big symbol. So I feel like just putting the fortress in the shape of a giant star, not only is it artistic, it's making it functional, and it's also like mental warfare at the same time. So Dorn just went...
This fortress is in space, right?
No, this fortress is on the planet. And,
on the planet.
Yeah. And let me pull up the name of the planet, because
he had a lot of balls to invite Imperials to come to the planet, land on the planet, and then go in to the fortress in a way that it's an open door scenario.
Yeah. So the planet that was based on was called Sebastus 4, and this all took place during the Horus Heresy. And
the end of the Horus Heresy.
Well, actually, the entire Horus Heresy has ended. They moved on to the Scouring, and this was before they split off onto the Codexes. This was before the splitting of the Legions, and this is something that Dorn wanted to do. That's why I say there's a lot of symbolism here, because Dorn wanted to do this as a symbolic...
He still had commands of the Legion.
It's for him, it's an act of redemption while he still had command of the Legion, and it's a symbolic purging. It's kind of like the test of pain, like with the pain glove, before his chapter is to be broken down to Codex compliant chapters. And this makes a little bit more sense later on in the story. Yeah. So what happened was that Dorn just came in rashly. He tried to orbital bombard the planet. So there's a lot of criticisms as to, why didn't Dorn just blow up the whole planet and all that and just be done with it, destroy the entire Iron Warrior chapter. Well, Perdurabo obviously thought about that, so the entire place was shielded properly. And just like in a good siege, he had ways to attack the besieger, which is thermonuclear nukes. A lot of them. So he started nuking the Imperial Fist fleet, and then Dorn was like, oh well, shit, we can't take down the shield, so we have to do a landing. So Dorn, not thinking right, he sent down his entire chapter, and this is like a foreshadowing with like the whole Beast fiasco, I feel like, because during the War of the Beast, they kind of did the same thing, and then the entire Imperial Fists Legion kind of got wiped out, if you remember. So here's Dorn doing the exact same thing several thousand years before, basically dropping the entirety of his chapter onto this one planet, and then Perdurabo basically did the next spiteful thing, was like, oh, you're coming down onto this planet, so he just self-destructed all his nukes. He basically did a Vrex, not a Vrex, but a Krieg on himself. So he detonated all the nuclear silos. He basically nuked the planet that he's sitting on, and that just created a condition that was so horrible that there was like no chance of radio chatter leaking out. There were like dust storms everywhere. The Imperial Fists could not call for any kind of air support. They could not even communicate with each other. There's radiation everywhere. He basically just turned the entire planet into Krieg over in that one moment, just to make things even shittier for the Imperial Fists. And at the same time, when everything dropped, the Iron Warrior fleet activated and ambushed the fleet on top of the planet. So this forced the Imperial Fist fleet to basically scatter, and this meant that there was no additional support going into the planet in the foreseeable future. So overall, this is a very, very shitty situation.
Detonated those nukes. He was still on the planet, right? The Perturabo.
Yeah, Perturabo just detonated nukes while he was on the planet.
So assuming his fortress is well shielded from the blast.
Assuming so, because it was standing up to orbital bombardment.
Okay.
Yeah, and that just pretty much proves how petty he was.
This guy.
Yeah, and so while they were fighting through this entire killing field, Dorn was basically forced to run around watching his sons die. He had to personally intervene multiple times to prevent entire wipeouts of his legion. This entire time, Perturabo could have wiped out the entire Imperial Fists Legion basically anytime he wanted. It was basically stated or insinuated that he kept this entire thing going on for 3 weeks and 6 days just to prolong Dorn's anguish.
Maximum suffrage.
Yeah, so you can see like this entire event is basically to Primarch's ego while this entire thing is happening. There's Robert Dorn going for their redemption through the act of pain, and then Peter Turbo just being a petulant man-child.
Autistic one, but yes.
Yes, pay 1 CP for maximize autism. And so eventually it got to the point where it just couldn't be won, and the Ultramarines had to step in. So this all went through for 3 weeks and 6 days of just bloodshed, until the Ultramarines came in, scattered the Iron Warriors fleet, and Perturabo knew that he had to withdraw. So he did not get his overall objective. Perturabo did not get his primary objective, which was wiping out the Legion, despite him having the power to do that whenever he wanted. He just didn't, so that's him being his worst enemy again. Pettiness got in the way. His ego got in the way of the primary objective, which is something that you see a lot with Perturabo. So he did the next petulant thing, which was that he made it so that it was impossible to recover all the gene seed that was lost from the Imperial Fist. I think overall about like 400 bodies were not recovered. Now this is where it just gets really weird, because it said that Perturabo offered up these gene seeds to the Chaos Gods, which is actually something very, very uncharacteristic of him, because Perturabo does not worship the Chaos Gods. He sees them as a tool. I don't think he really believes in gods.
I don't think it's that far off, because if I'm super petty, right, and I'm not just fucking you by you not claiming what you deserve, which is what the deep gene seed is supposed to belong to, I'm deliberately giving it to your worst enemies, and we know, or he knows, that what they're going to do with those gene seed is not going to be anything good.
Yeah,
so,
it's kind of like destroying the Eldar Spirit Stone level of pettiness.
Yeah, it's a double pettiness, right?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not even going to use your gene seed. I'm just going to piss and shit all over it. Yeah, I buy that. So basically, by the end of that, there weren't a lot of Imperial Fists left. We know a rough number that was remaining, and I think it was around 6,000. I'm not sure how much he had when he went in. He probably had about 50,000 left after the end of the, or maybe even less than that, maybe 30,000.
Like a third or 1/5 left from what it originally was.
Yeah,
that's a massive loss for within 3 weeks' time.
Yeah, within such a small area as well. You have to remember it's like a 6x. It's less than 6x6. It's like 6 by 5 kilometers. Roughly 6,000 remained, because we know that he did form, including the Imperial Fist, he did form 6 chapters out of it. So you had the Imperial Fists, you had the Crimson Fists, you had the Fist Exemplars, you had the Black Templars, Soul Drinkers and the Exoriator. I'm going to mispronounce this. The Exoriators. That's roughly 6,000 Marines. I just want to further speculate because do you know much about the Soul Drinkers?
Yeah, the Captain Master with like spider legs.
Yes, but do you know like deep lore about the Soul Drinkers?
I don't know the full lore.
So this may be like a spoiler for the Soul Drinker novel, but basically in that novel they did like a gene seed test and they are not Imperial Fists. And they did a gene seed test and their gene seed record does not match any known legion.
They were assigned by the Imperium during this time period.
So during the Horus Heresy, there was the the missing legions, and it's basically heavily touched on that the Soul Drinkers may be parts of the missing legion that were taken on by the Imperial Fist because Rebute and Dorn were arguing against the extinction of those two legions.
For Space Wars took on those two legions.
No, it was mainly the Ultramarines and the Imperial Fist. But the Primarchs got mind wiped, so they don't know the exact going-ons with that, but that's just heavily implied. So I find it very interesting that the bunch with the unknown gene seeds somehow survive. No, I won't say intact, but there's enough of them left over to form like an entire chapter. I'm not sure if that really points to like a specific trait that allowed them to survive, or if Dorn somehow was aware enough to keep enough of them alive to form a chapter afterwards.
I think knowing Dorn and how he does things, I think he would be intentionally it's like, okay, I had to kill 99% of you guys, but if I could, I'll protect some of you left. And I'll put them to good use. So I think it's one of those cases.
And then just group them together as a second founding chapter. I feel like this is a very deliberate thing that he did. Because you have to also notice that the second founding for him, they're not just random like Imperial Fists, they're just not like evenly, like randomly divided into equal parts. You had the Crusaders, the Resh people who are like Sigsmund, into the Black Templars. You had the, Exoriators, to get his emo side, his depression side into their own chapters. And then the Fist Exemplars, which are basically, the super noble guys into their own group. So I feel like Dorn knew what he was doing when he was splitting up his legion.
He's autistic enough to distinguish between the characters of different groups of people.
Yeah. So I always thought that was like a very interesting thing. So that's all I have. It's very short. It's very it's very straightforward. It's lore that most people would know, but I think this is a very interesting case of a stronghold in 40k lore. It's it's a symbol of power. It's a fortress used defensively and offensively, and you have the commanders basically set as the will of the commanders set into the backdrop of this entire encounter. It's like almost like a perfect siege story, I feel like.
I would actually be interested personally to see what the descriptions are when it comes to what were the defenses of the actual on the ground. I mean,
it's all very standard. It's all very standard. Like on the surface level, it feels almost like Perch Rabble, wanted a fair fight. There was not a lot of warp fuckery going on that we know about. It was like an entire killing ground and all that. It's prepared defenses. It's not fair. But at the same time, he was killing them with very conventional tactics, such as killing zones, hardened bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, razor wire. I don't know how razor wire would affect Space Marines. It's actually written in there like razor wires. Okay, they're in armor, but
typically,
tank traps
from the description.
Yeah.
So basically, from the description, it's D-Day on steroids, and you're walking into at least three sides of them.
Imagine
defenses.
D-Day if after all the troops landed, the Germans whipped out an entire naval fleet out of nowhere, sank the entire Allied fleet, and then trapped them in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy.
Except Europe is the size of, I don't know, a small town. Yeah. So, that's basically it. I'll pass it on to you.